Greetings, and welcome to another episode of The Record of Arms. I'm your host, Mark 7, and today, as always, it's great to have a chance to talk with you all about military history. This is the 20th episode, and I must say I never really thought that I would make this many, and I want to thank all of you who have listened, who's made it worth my while to do so. This time again, we'll be looking at the Spanish Civil War, and should be no surprise. Last time, we started off a look at one of the many aspects of the air war over Spain, the operations of the German Jagdwaffe. This is a fighter component of the Luftwaffe air group sent there by Hitler to lend assistance to Franco's rebels. This Luftwaffe contingent, with an effective strength of about a dozen first-line squadrons, was part of the larger Wehrmacht force sent to Spain, which is known as the Condor Legion. The impact of this German contingent would have a decisive impact on the war in Spain and provide a foreshadowing of what the first part of the Second War would look like. My sources for this one will be the same as for the previous episode. These are two short books. First titled Jagwaffe, Spanish Civil War by Eric Mombeck. The other is called Spanish Civil War Air Forces by Christopher Shores. So now let's begin with a brief summary of what was covered in the first part, and then get on with the story where we left off in the early days of 1937. The pre-war Spanish Air Force was small and outdated. Its principal fighter, the Nieuport de la Grenadier-52, was a late 20s French design built in Spain by Hispano-Suiza. This was a mediocre sesquiplane design, a kind of biplane with a half-size lower wing. Its top speed was barely 165 miles per hour, and it lacked the maneuverability of a full biplane design. Like most fighters of the interwar period, it was armed with a pair of rifle-caliber machine guns. About 125 of these aircraft were procured by the Spanish in the first years of the 30s, but by mid-1936 fewer than 40 were in flying condition. These were organized into 3 squadrons, known in Spanish usage as grupos, stationed at airfields near Madrid, Seville, and Barcelona. The Spanish had a larger number of Brigade 19s. These were 2-seater scout bombers of the kind very widespread among the air services of the interwar period. Like many of these types, the plane was slow, though not much slower than the Nieuport, and was armed with a machine gun firing forward and a pair on a ring mount in the rear cockpit. The Brigadeers could carry a small bomb load, and were in fact the only aircraft in the Spanish Air Force service capable of bombing attacks. Other uses for these kind of planes were short-range reconnaissance and artillery spotting. These are the most numerous aircraft in Spanish service, with perhaps 100 in operable condition in mid-1936. Aside from a small number of miscellaneous transport and training aircraft, the brigades and the Nieuports constituted between them the totality of useful Spanish Air Force assets in 1936. When the uprising began, the situation in the country became chaotic. The first few days saw dozens of local uprisings as local garrisons declared for the revolt, and were opposed by loyal soldiers, police units, and members of the left-wing militia organizations. These local battles were fought with little centralized control or coordination. After the first week, the situation began to resolve itself. The country was split into 2 factions. The rebels controlled the colony of Spanish Morocco, where the core strength of the Spanish army was stationed. On the mainland, they had secured a territory around the cities of Seville and Cadiz in the south, and the greater part of the conservative northern provinces. The coalition nominally loyal to the Republic, in which the dominant force was the armed leftist organizations, held the rest of the country, including most of the major cities and industrial areas, but this was split into 2 territories, one composing the bulk of the center, east, and south of the mainland, and the other a narrow strip along the northern Atlantic coast. The majority of the Spanish Air Force, as well as the small naval air service, remained loyal. The rebels controlled the air units that had been stationed in the African colonies, which consisted of a group of brigades as well as a handful of passenger transport aircraft. Of the fighters in Spanish hands, only the Grupo stationed at Tablada Airfield outside Seville had joined the revolt. These 13 Nieuports would be augmented in the confused early days by an element of 3 fighters from the Madrid squadron, which would move south to Granada Airfield. They landed here unaware that the rebels had control of the airfield. Given the small scale and relatively weak combat power of the air resources available to the Spaniards themselves, these would have played little part in a purely Spanish conflict. However, the Civil War would not remain exclusively Spanish for very long. Within a week, the Germans and Italians had sent aircraft to aid the revolt. Officers of the Spanish Navy had joined the revolt, but the sailors refused. These mutinied when ordered to Morocco to assist in bringing the strong army formations there to the mainland, where they were desperately needed to defeat the unexpectedly formidable resistance being encountered at the hands of the leftist militia organizations. Even worse for the right-wing rebel coalition, the leftists were carrying out a program of social revolution in the territories that they controlled. The transport of the Army of Africa's skilled soldiers to the mainland was essential to the survival of the revolt. The German and Italian planes were sent to aid this transport. They sent 3 engine transport planes, Junkers 52s in the German case and Savoia Marchettis in the Italian. These were sent to Morocco, where the armies were controlled by Francisco Franco. Soon the transports had joined the few Spanish planes ferrying the veteran soldiers from Morocco to Seville. Thousands would arrive this way in the next 2 months, and this very likely saved the revolt from defeat. First German fighters were connected with this effort. They came by ship as part of the initial small-scale German effort known as Operation Magic Fire. These included 6 Luftwaffe fighter pilots and 6 Heinkel HE-51 fighters. German planes were sent to protect the transports, and were only ordered to engage in combat if this was not avoidable. Their main task was to be the training of Spanish pilots to fly the German planes, more of which would be sent in future shipments. This Heinkel fighter was one of the last biplanes to serve this function in German service. It was a relatively poor performer, with low top speed and mediocre handling, but it was better than what the Spaniards had. It was armed with a pair of 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns. The B model HE-51 differed from the A model by the provision of fittings for a 170-liter drop tank under the fuselage, and the addition of some bracing wires for the undercarriage members. C model added racks for 6 10-kilogram bombs, and these were the variants that were used in Spain. Like most Condor Legion aircraft of the first generation, the Heinkel carried no radio equipment. A total of 126 HE-51s would eventually be sent to Spain. The first of these would go into action in early August. Spanish pilots had success with these planes in the air, but inexperience led to a rash of landing accidents in the first few days. This led the German pilots in Spain to request permission of Berlin to fly combat themselves, and this permission was granted. More HE-51s would arrive in the next few months, equipping a small number of rebel fighter units. They were not outstanding in this role, but gave a good account of themselves against the outmoded Spanish and French planes which were flying for the Republic at this time. German air presence in the country remained quite small, with perhaps 15 to 20 pilots in the country by the end of September. Major support for the rebels in the air at this time was coming from Italy. As the war spun up in the first months, the effort on both sides became more and more focused on the rebel attempt to capture the capital. As October wore on, the first major assaults by the rebel armies, accompanied by their air forces, were fought on the approaches to the city and then in the suburbs. The Italian, German, and rebel forces appeared over the capital, flying dozens and dozens of bombing raids against the increasingly strained Republican defenders. By the end of the month, remaining Republican fighters had been all but eliminated, and the rebels and their allies had secured dominance in the air. As November began, they geared up for their final assault to take the capital, and with it, hopefully, end the war. However, while they were getting ready to do this, the first major support of the Republic from another power arrived. The Soviet government decided to aid the embattled Republic, and it was soon sending large numbers of modern weapons into the Mediterranean ports of the Spanish coast. These included some of the best weapons in Spain at the time. In particular, 2 modern Soviet fighter types were sent, which outclassed the German and Italian types in service. These were both the work of the Polikarpov Design Bureau. First was the I-15, known in Spain as the Chateau. This was a tough and agile biplane fighter armed with 4 machine guns. This was the best biplane fighter in the country, matched only by later marks of the Italian CR-32. The second was the I-16, which was known in Spain as the Rata. This was a streamlined radial engine monoplane, and it's faster than any other fighter in Spain, and was perhaps the best fighter in the world when it was introduced. In Spain, it was dominant over other fighters in rebel service, being much faster than any of its opponents as well as having superior climbing and diving performance. Coming along with these new modern fighters was an equally advanced twin-engine bomber, the Tupolev SP-2, a sleek design that was faster than any of the fighters in rebel hands. When faced with these new Russian aircraft over Madrid, the inferiority of the Heinkel HE-51 was brutally revealed. The German plane was at a severe disadvantage against either of the Polikarpov fighters, and was too slow to intercept the new Tupolev bombers. The advent of the Soviet planes abruptly reversed the balance of power in the air. For the German fighters, the situation was grave. So bad was it that Heinkels were retasked with ground attack duties, while air combat was taken over by the Italians, whose CR-32s were the best available. When faced with the sudden appearance of Russian aid to the Republic, the German High Command was forced to recognize that no quick victory would be achieved by Franco's rebels. A long fight between evenly matched sides was shaping up in Spain. They saw 2 options: abandon the rebels as a lost cause, or significantly increase their aid to counterbalance that of the Soviets. They chose the latter. This decision led to the establishment of the Condor Legion, a Wehrmacht contingent, ostensibly of volunteers, numbering about 4,500 men. The major portion of this was the Luftwaffe air unit consisting of about 12 squadrons of first-line aircraft. A bomber group, known as KG-88, was accompanied by a reconnaissance group, A-88, and a fighter complement, known as the Jagdwaffe, with the unit designation JG-88. This Jagdwaffe consisted of 3 squadrons of Heinkel fighters, and these would be tasked initially with close support missions. The fighters already in Spain as part of Magic Fire were incorporated into JG-88 as the 4th Squadron. Also sent to Spain at this time, in response to the inadequacy of the Heinkel fighter, was a group of prototypes of new fighters in the preliminary stages of production. 4 Bf-109 prototypes and one of the Heinkel HE-112 were sent by a ship to Seville. The fighters were a big step forward from the Heinkel, capable of the speed and vertical performance of the I-16. They had not been tested in battle, however. By the end of December, the battles to take Madrid had been fought, and the rebel offensive was exhausted. Testing of the new fighter prototypes was undertaken as both sides regrouped and prepared for the next round in what looked to be a long struggle. By the end of December 1936, the Jagdwaffe's aircraft had been withdrawn from employment as interceptors or bomber escorts. These air-to-air duties were performed by the 3 squadrons of the Italian Aviazione Legionnaria flying the Fiat CR-32 biplane fighter. This aircraft, which was known as the Chiri, was the best fighter in the air forces of the rebels and their allies. The Spanish Air Force had 2 units of HE-51 fighters, including the elite Patrola Azul, which means Blue Patrol, led by Joaquin Garcia Morato, the leading rebel fighter ace. These Spanish Heinkels did no better against the Russian fighters than the Luftwaffe ones, but were flown with panache and achieved a limited degree of success in their now very vulnerable aircraft. The German fighter squadrons would be tasked with the close support of the rebel and Italian armies. These missions, which consisted of low-level strafing and bombing attacks, would become the principal job of the Heinkel fighter for the remainder of its employment in Spain. The aircraft would prove deadly in this role, despite the limitations of its armament, which was only a pair of rifle-caliber machine guns and a total of 6 small 10-kilogram bombs. Part of the effectiveness in these kind of attacks can be explained by the comparative lack of anti-aircraft weapons on the Republican side. This was a problem on both sides, as the pre-war Spanish army had been almost totally lacking in anti-aircraft artillery. What flak there was in the country was imported, and while the Soviets sent the Republic modern weapons of this type, they were thin on the ground. Most often, the Heinkels expected to be met with small arms and light machine gun fire only. Pilots of the German machines soon demonstrated a proficiency and persistence in these attacks that earned them the nickname cadenas, or chains, for their practice of repeatedly hitting the same targets again and again until whatever it was they were shooting at was neutralized. In February 1937, the 4 squadrons of JG-88 were stationed at the airfields of Escalona, Almarox, Villa de Prado, and León, and were thus disposed to meet threats in the Madrid region and over Santander and Asturias. In the meantime, the prototypes that had become part of VJ-88, the experimental fighter unit, were undergoing testing. Hannes Trautloft, one of the emerging aces of the 2nd Squadron, was sent to Tablada Airfield outside of Seville, where he was assigned one of the Bf-109 prototypes, the V3. As a personal emblem, he would have a green heart painted on the fuselage of this aircraft. This green heart emblem would later become the device for JG-54, a fighter group that Trautloff would command in August 1940. The aircraft proved quite satisfactory, as fast as the Rada, but with better overall handling. Dispatched to Spain of early production versions, the first models of which were just then beginning to come off the production line, was recommended. The HE-112 V3 prototype was unarmed when it arrived at Tablada Airfield. It was fitted with a 20mm automatic cannon firing through the nose and assigned to Oberleutnant Gunther Radosch. The cannon made the 112 prototype the most heavily armed fighter in Spain. Radosch found the aircraft suitable for service, and when testing was over, it was handed over to Unterofficer Max Schultz to fly operationally as part of the 1st Squadron. The 20mm cannon proved deadly in the squadron's ground strafing operations, especially to the thinly armored tanks and armored cars used by the contending armies. For this reason, it became known as the Dosenöffner, or can opener. The early months of 1937 were the end of the first phase of the war, which culminated in the failure of the rebels to capture the capital after months of intensive operations. The men and planes of the Jagdwaffe continued their close support work throughout these months. As March began, the focus of the war began to move away from the region around the capital and the central highlands of the country. The frustration of the rebel campaign here was in large part due to the intervention of large number of Soviet fighter pilots and tankers, who fought alongside their Spanish Republican protégés and who were also now armed with increasing numbers of up-to-date Soviet weapons. Some of these weapons, in particular the tanks and the aircraft, were markedly superior to their Axis opponents. However, this Russian aid came almost entirely through the Mediterranean into Republican ports on the eastern coast, primarily Cartagena. Republican provinces in the north along the Biscay coast were physically cut off from the bulk of that territory, and thus a much smaller amount of Russian aid was received there. Furthermore, this thin and relatively vulnerable coastal strip contained a large portion of Spain's mineral resources and heavy industries, including the principal producers of armor plate, heavy ordnance, and ships. Franco thus determined to go over to the defensive on the battlefronts around the capital, and elsewhere in the larger Republican territory, and concentrate his armies for an offensive against the Republican enclave in the north, beginning with the Basques. The Condor Legion would be fully committed to this offensive. The northern campaign would coincide with the arrival of a new generation of aircraft for the Legion, as new types just now coming into production were sent to the Spanish battlefield. Though it is often asserted that the testing and evaluation of this new generation of war machines coming out of Hitler's factories was the principal motivation for the German intervention in Spain, it is closer to the truth to say that other factors determined the Wehrmacht presence there, and that its leaders simply took advantage of the opportunity. None of the new machines concerned, except for the 88mm flat gun, the Panzer I, and the HE-70 reconnaissance plane were available at the time of Hitler's intervention and subsequent decision to allow Germans in the theater to engage in combat. But once there, it would have displayed a very uncharacteristic incompetence for Wehrmacht leaders to not send their new machines to the only troops under their command engaged in combat. In the case of the Jagdwaffe in particular, such a decision would have amounted to allowing their pilots to continue to operate at a grave disadvantage. The first of the new fighters would arrive in the theater in early March. They would be assigned to the 2nd Squadron, which would be the first to convert to the new type. The first batch of 3 Bf-109B-1s were delivered to it on the 14th. These machines were a very definite improvement over the Heinkel 51, and gave the Germans an aircraft that could meet the Russians on equal terms. These very early models were much less capable than the 109s which would take part in the Second World War. The most important difference between them and the later 109s was the use of the Junkers Jumo 210 engine. This was a fine engine, but much less powerful than the Daimler-Benz DB series units that were powered later models. As a result, the early 109s had significantly lower performance than the later DB engine models. The 109's counterpart in the Luftwaffe's Zerstörer, or heavy offensive fighter units, the twin-engine Bf-110, which was also powered by the DB engine, was going through a similar development, beginning with poor-performing Jumo 210 powered models. The early 109s sent to the Legion also had some of the drawbacks of the HE-51, namely the need to manually cock the machine guns after each burst of fire, and a carved, fixed-pitch wooden propeller. More 109s would arrive to fill out the 2nd Squadron. These would soon include the upgraded B-2 model, which differed from the B-1 principally by using a VDM variable pitch propeller based on an American Hamilton standard design. As might be expected, the new propeller significantly enhanced the application of engine power in flight, and most of the B-1s would have their wooden props replaced with the new air screw. The HE-51s that were replaced by the 109s were handed over to the rebels. The same would occur with the other first-generation Condor Legion planes that were being replaced by newer models at this time. Along with the 109, two of the most familiar German bomber types of the Second World War would make their first appearance in Spain during early 1937. Early marks of the Heinkel 111 twin-engine bomber were arriving to replace the Ju-52 and two of KG-88's 3 squadrons. Another twin-engine bomber, the Dornier Do-17, would also arrive. First Dorniers would be assigned to the reconnaissance group, where they would replace the HE-70s, which had proven themselves to be mechanically unreliable. Shortly after this initial batch, further Do-17s would arrive to equip the other recon squadron and the last squadron of KG-88. A few Heinkel HS-123 attack biplanes would also arrive. Despite the fact that these were assigned to Sturzkampf, or dive bomber units in Germany, in Spain, they would be used as in a ground attack role very similar to those of the HE-51s. Not long after the arrival of the 109s in mid-March, the 4th Squadron of JG-88, which had been made up of the survivors of the Heinkel units originally sent as part of Operation Magic Fire, was disbanded. Its distinctive top hat's insignia was transferred to the 2nd Squadron, as were some of its personnel. Therefore, at the end of March, the Jagdwaffe consisted of 3 squadrons, the 1st and 3rd flying close support missions in Heinkel 51s, plus the one HE-112 prototype, and one squadron, the 2nd, flying Bf-109B models on fighter missions. The commitment of the Legion to support Franco's attack in the north involved the transfer of the Jagdwaffe northwards to Vitoria. The ships bearing supplies and weapons from Germany, which had previously delivered their cargoes to Cadiz, were also redirected to better support the northern campaign, and began to unload at Vigo on the Atlantic coast. The major thrust of the attack was to be towards the principal Basque province of Vizcaya, located at the corner of the Bay of Biscay, where the coast turns from east-west to north-south and the Pyrenees run down to the Atlantic. From Vitoria, the Luftwaffe squadrons would be deployed forward to new bases once the campaign began. Republican air strength in the north was relatively weak. A small number of I-15s were stationed here, but the main strength consisted of aircraft that had been imported from abroad during the first weeks of the war. There were two main types procured. The first were a batch of 27 Kohlhoven Fk-51 biplanes intended to act as fighters, although these aircraft were really little more than advanced trainers. From the Czechs had come 30 Avia A-101 biplane reconnaissance bombers. 22 more of these had been ordered, but the ship carrying them into Spanish waters was intercepted by the rebel cruiser Almirante Severa, and the planes fell into rebel hands. Both of these aircraft were of very mediocre performance, and hardly a match even for the Heinkels in the air. The Republicans also had Grupo 30 Santander, which was known as the Krone Circus, after a traveling variety show popular in Europe at the time. This unit consisted of a collection of various foreign and domestic types, mainly civil craft that had been trapped in the region by the uprising and converted to military use, but it also included several single examples of various foreign fighter models sent to the Spanish in the few years prior to this by their manufacturers for evaluation and possible license production. This assortment of miscellaneous planes was pressed into service against the oncoming rebels. The rebel territory separating the main Republican area from the northern enclave was not so wide as to be uncrossable by the Russian fighters, but the passage was quite hazardous. The offensive began on the last day of the month. The Heinkel squadrons were detailed to support the rebel armies advancing towards Bilbao, the capital and stronghold of the Basques. The 2nd Squadron, eager to test their new mounts, were assigned bomber escort and interception missions, and were soon in combat with the Russian fighters there. They had their first victory on the 6th of April, when one of the 109s brought down an I-15. It was in the first weeks that the 109 established its preeminence in Spanish skies. It outclassed the I-15 in all characteristics, especially the B-2 models fitted with the new propellers. Only the I-16 could challenge it, but even the Rada was at a disadvantage against the new German fighter. Even the Umo engine 109s were just as fast as the Rada and better in a turning fight or a dive. The Rada could outclimb the German machines, at least at altitudes below 5,000 meters, and they could roll faster. The I-16 also had a better power-to-weight ratio, enabling it to accelerate somewhat more quickly. The air-cooled radial engine of the I-16 was less vulnerable to damage than the liquid-cooled engine of the German machine. The armament of the fighters was very similar, but the German plane carried more ammunition, while the Russian SHKS machine gun had a faster firing rate. The reflector gun sight used by the Messerschmitt was much better than the crude telescopic sight used on the I-16s. Overall, the performance of the I-16 and the 109 was very broadly comparable. Like most Russian designs of the period, the I-16 was at its best below 10,000 feet, and with equally skilled pilots, the outcome of combat here would depend on numbers, luck, and tactics. Above 10,000 feet, the Messerschmitt held a clear advantage, which grew as altitude increased. The 109 pilot could always disengage by diving away, but the I-16 was also able to escape the Messerschmitt by outclimbing the German machine at most altitudes. The arrival of improved versions of each aircraft as the war went on would tilt the balance in favor of one type or the other, ending finally with the arrival of the E-model 109s using the Daimler-Benz DB engine in the closing stages of the war. The DB engine fighters were superior to the best variants of the Rada. These fighters would not arrive in time for the northern campaign, however, which would be fought with the Umo engine V model. The small scale of Republican air resources in the north meant that little air-to-air combat was seen here compared to that which occurred in the battles of Madrid and Aragon. The major push towards Bilbao was accompanied by a minor thrust towards the town of Teruel in the east as a diversion to occupy the Republican forces in the southern portion of their territory, prevent them from massing for a counterattack while the rebels dealt with the north. This succeeded and drew the attention of a major portion of the Republic's air power in the south. Here the Heinkels, which had been discarded by the Germans, saw heavy action in the hands of some of the finest rebel pilots. The Republic's air strength was also distracted during this period by the ominous buildup of Italian bomber units based on the Balearic island of Minorca. From here, Italian SM-81s and the newer SM-79s could threaten the entire Republican Mediterranean coast. The Republic was obliged to retain a large share of their best fighters, which were the I-16s, near the coast to guard against this growing danger. The Germans in the north were therefore engaged mainly in ground attack and bomber escort missions throughout April. The infamous Gernika raid was carried out at this time. Bombers from KG-88, escorted by fighters from JG-88, hit the undefended town on the 26th of April, killing more than 300 people. This was the first big terror raid in Europe since the Great War, and news of the bombing spread across the world rapidly, causing a wave of revulsion and condemnation so pronounced that the town's name is still associated with the modern forms of barbarism inherent in total war. The Germans claimed to have been aiming at a bridge just outside the town, and therefore hit the town by mistake. They also maintained in some accounts that the decision to hit the town had been given by Spanish rebel officers. The rebels in turn claimed that the town was burned down by anarchist militiamen among the Republican troops in order to pin the responsibility for the destruction on the fascists. All these excuses aside, the incident bears enough similarity to the mass bombing of civilian centers that would shortly become normalized that there is no reason to doubt that the town was deliberately destroyed. Accounts of survivors frequently include descriptions of the accompanying fighters strafing fleeing civilians on the ground. These kind of actions were right in the bailiwick of the close support Heinkel squadrons, who no doubt turned their machine guns on the terrified and scattering citizens of the town, who they would have described as Reds. However interesting I find the actions and stories of the Germans in Spain, or anywhere else for that matter, it's important to remember that after all, most of these men were Nazis themselves, or at least sympathetic enough with Hitler's regime to sign up and fight in his forces. In any case, the rebel advance on the fortifications surrounding Bilbao, so-called Ring of Iron, ground across the Basque country, and by the 1st of May the city was surrounded. During the hard-fought battles to break through the ring, the HE-51 squadrons flew numerous missions in support of rebel and Italian troops. Many of their missions were flown against Basque positions on the high ground near Amorbieta and Bizcagui, which were the keys to this sector of the defenses. The HE-112 prototype would take part in these battles as part of the 1st Squadron. Close support tactics that were to make the Luftwaffe so capable in support of German ground forces were first worked out during these battles. Situated somewhere with a good view, an officer, usually von Richthofen himself, would spot targets and vector the Heinkels in towards them. This command and control arrangement was clumsy, as the Heinkels carried no radio equipment. Instead, targets had to be indicated by telephone to the airfield, which would then assign them to the Heinkel pilots after their return for the previous sortie. Heinkel's new job also suggested a new paint scheme, and the flat gray finish of these biplanes was painted over with dark green camouflage patches to better disguise them from enemy fighters searching from above. According to Fritz Losigkeit, one of the pilots of the 3rd Squadron, ground attack missions were usually not very dangerous. The Heinkel usually faced only small arms fire. The strike capability of the Heinkel was limited by its comparatively light armament. This was augmented by an experimental munition that was created in the field. The biplane could carry only small 10-kilogram bombs, but had a fitting for a 170-liter drop tank. 2 of the 10-kilogram bombs were lashed to the full drop tank. When dropped, the bombs would ignite the fuel and blast the burning gasoline over a wide area, creating a terrifying early form of napalm. Even without this ugly weapon, the psychological shock value of a sudden air attack on troops who, like the majority of the soldiers in the Spanish theater as a whole, had no training or experience of how to counteract it, was enormous, and often produced an effect on a particular battlefield out of all proportion to the actual firepower represented by the aircraft's weapons. When proper flak was encountered, however, the Heinkels ran into trouble, as Losigkeit himself experienced. On one such attack on Republican artillery, he was targeted by a Soviet light anti-aircraft cannon, which shot his plane down. Losigkeit would spend the subsequent 8 months as a prisoner of the Republic before being repatriated as part of a prisoner exchange. The Republicans in the south attempted to send aid to the beleaguered Basques. On the 22nd, it was decided to risk the hazardous journey over the rebel zone to fly some fighters to the area. 10 I-15 set out on this mission, but only 7 arrived in Bilbao. These were all but annihilated by the 109s within a few days. On the 31st of May, the Republicans at Guadalajara, near Madrid, mounted an attack on the rebel front there in an attempt to relieve the pressure on the Basques. This assault was carried out by the International Brigades, and came through the passes of the Guadarrama Mountains towards Segovia. Major air units were moved from the Basque front to meet this thrust, including the 2nd Squadron and its 109s. Here the new German fighter would meet the Tupolev SB-2 bomber for the first time. The new aircraft came as a surprise to the Russian pilots here, and the 109 was the only fighter on the rebel side that could catch the bomber in level flight. The first victories of the Germans over these aircraft came when 2 of the Russian machines were shot down by Messerschmitts on the 8th of June. Another flight of fighters, this time 8 I-16s, were sent across the rebel territory on the 17th, but these went to Santander as the area around Bilbao is controlled by the rebels at this point. 2 squadrons of I-16s and perhaps a dozen I-15s would also make the perilous trip by the beginning of July. The diversion caused by the Guadalajara attack was not enough to save the Basques. Bilbao fell on the 19th of June, and this spelled the end of their autonomy. Much of the success of the drive on Bilbao was achieved by the Italian troops of the CTV, who performed very well in this, their second major victory in Spain. Not long after this, the Republic mounted another counteroffensive on the central front near the capital, aimed at the town of Brunette. This attack was launched to draw rebel forces away from the north, and in the air at least it did this. Virtually all the rebel, German, and Italian air forces were redirected to meet this new threat. With the exception of a pair of Italian fighter units, only second-line aircraft such as the brigades and the captured Czech Avia 101s left against the remaining Republicans in the north, who were regrouping in Santander and Asturias. Very small numbers of Republican planes after the fall of Bilbao meant that they risked little in the move south. Altogether, 150 first-line planes would be sent south. JG-88 was moved to the airfield at Avia, which was shared with the DO-17 equipped reconnaissance squadron and rebel fighter units including Murato's Blue Patrol, now flying Italian CR-32s. The Republic gathered more than 200 aircraft to support the drive on Brunette. Their air force was at the peak of its strength here. Many well-trained Spanish pilots were now available, including many who had recently arrived back from training in Russian schools. During the battles over Brunette, their air force would include the lowest proportion of Russian pilots in any of the major Republican actions. The forces included the best they had to offer. This included the elite Primera Escuadrilla de Moscas, an I-16 unit made up of international volunteers. Several other groups of I-15s and I-16s were massed for the attack, as well as 2 groups of Tupolev bombers and several of reconnaissance and light bomber aircraft. A series of large air battles, some of the biggest of the whole war, were fought as part of the Brunette campaign. Some of these would involve over 200 planes. The operations were conducted during the hottest part of the year, with temperatures often climbing above 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 50 degrees Celsius. The 109 Squadron would have its highest scoring day on the 12th of July, when its pilots would claim 6 Republican planes. 2 of these would be the work of Unterofficer Junes. This pilot would himself be shot down on the 17th by an American, Frank Tinker, a volunteer flying an I-16 as part of the Primera Escuadrilla de Moscas. Germans would claim 5 more Republicans over the course of the rest of the month. The 109s would make a significant contribution to the air campaign of Brunette, accounting for about a third of the Republican planes lost in battle. While they were doing this, the 1st and 3rd Squadrons were engaged in intensive ground attack operations. On a typical day, in this case on the 24th, the 1st Squadron flew 3 missions or more. These were directed from the ground in the same way as they had been in the north. The HE-112 prototype continued to operate with the HE-51s until the aircraft was lost after a crash landing due to engine failure. The town of Brunette was taken, retaken, and then partially retaken again in an effort that exhausted the Republican offensive. The Brunette action was over by the middle of August. In the end, the Republican lost about 25,000 men, about 50 planes for little gain. The rebels and their allies took losses of about 13,000 men and 25 planes. Legion was moved back to the northern front to take part in the impending conquest of Santander, the next target in the north. The Jagdwaffe was rebased to Alardere and Calahorra. This time, the 2nd Squadron was still the only one equipped with the 109, of which they had 9 on hand. The 1st and 3rd Squadrons together fielded 18 HE-51s. Heinkel units began ground attack operations against troops and transport targets in Santander on the 2nd week of August. During the course of these, they were relocated to the forward field at Orzales on the 18th. The Messerschmitt Squadron continued to fly fighter missions, usually bomber escorts or fighter sweeps. They bring down 3 of the dwindling number of Russian fighters on the 17th. 2 of these kills were the work of Favorable Peter Baldwin. Another 3 Republican planes fell to the 109s on the next day. One of these, an I-15, was another kill by Baldwin, bringing his overall total to 8, which was the highest score yet achieved by any German pilot. This was the more remarkable as this pilot had been in Spain for less than a month at this time. Santander fell to the rebels on the 25th. By that time, more Bf-109s had arrived in Spain, and the 1st Squadron was in the process of conversion to the new plane. Once pilots were ready, the squadron resumed regular fighter duties, leaving only the 3rd Squadron flying close support with the Heinkels. The new 1st Squadron would mark its first air-to-air victory with the Messerschmitt fighter on the 27th, when Oberleutnant Harro Harder destroyed a Republican SP-2. While the rebels were mopping up resistance in the newly conquered province, the Republic launched another assault elsewhere in the country. This time they moved from the town of Belchite in Aragon and on to the approaches of Zaragoza. Their forces, supported by a force of more than 150 aircraft, advanced and were threatening the city by the 26th. The remaining Heinkel Squadron was among the forces sent to resist the new attack. At this time, the 3rd Squadron was under the leadership of Oberleutnant Adolf Galland, another Luftwaffe officer serving here who would go on to achieve prominence during the Second World War. During his leadership, the 3rd Squadron adopted the Mickey Mouse cartoon emblem for its squadron device. Another leading light in the wartime Jagdwaffe, Werner Mulders, this time an Oberleutnant as well, also flew with the 3rd Squadron at Zaragoza. The fierce fighting around Zaragoza ended with the defeat of the Republican advance on the 9th of September. The offensive in the north was resumed, and in its 3rd and final stage, against the remaining enclave in Asturias, began. Two 109 squadrons had here scored success against the shrinking enemy opposition. Harro Harder downed his 3rd enemy plane on the 7th. On the 27th, he shot down another pair of I-16s, while another 1st Squadron pilot claimed another. Harder destroyed another Rada on the 28th, and by the 13th of October, his tally stood at 10 victories. He was soon matched by Baudern. 3rd Squadron continued ground attack operations, including a conspicuous success in a raid on a fuel depot in the city of Gijón, which set the entire complex on fire. HE-51s were moved forward on September 21st to the coastal airfield at Lannis, from which they kept up pressure on the retreating Republican troops. The Asturian front collapsed on the 23rd of October, bringing an end to the war in the north. The remaining aircraft of 2 I-16 and 1 I-15 squadrons fell into rebel hands, and 4 others fled across the sea to France. Once the fighting in the north was over, the men of the Legion were sent to Leon to rest and have their aircraft serviced. On the 2nd of November, a new 4th Squadron was added to the strength of JG-88. This new 4th Squadron was led by Oberleutnant Eberhard von Trischler de Elsa, and was equipped with Heinkel 51s, a new batch of which had recently arrived aboard the cargo ship Golfo de Panama. Just before the establishment of this new squadron, the leadership of the Legion was changed, as Sperl was replaced by General Major Helmuth Volkmann, with Oberst Hermann Plocher taking over as Chief of Staff. The two air forces were evenly matched at this point in terms of fighter strength, with the Republic having a numerical advantage in aircraft of all types. The Republic in 1938 fielded about 450 planes, most of them Russian, including a small but growing number of I-15s built in Spanish factories. These domestic plants also indirectly added to the Republic's air strength by turning out large numbers of spare parts for the Russian fighters. Improved models of the I-15, so-called Super Chados, were also sent from Russia, arriving late in the year. These are the best biplane fighters to serve in Spain, excelling the CR-32s by most measures. The Hispano-Suiza plant was tooling up to produce the I-16 Type 10, a new model of the Rada that had recently arrived in the theater. These Spanish-built fighters would use the American Wright Cyclone radial engine rather than the Soviet type. This new fighter was also better armed, having 4 SHKAS machine guns rather than 2. Type 10, which was known in Spain as the Super Rada, was a marked improvement over the previous models, and could outperform the UMO engine 109s in a turning fight. The distinctive tactics of the Russian I-16 pilots, that of approaching the enemy from a higher altitude, then making a diving pass before breaking off and climbing to attack again, began to be used by the German pilots, whose new monoplane fighters could also exploit the new tactics of energy and speed. However, the period of strong Russian support for the Republic was coming to an end, as Stalin's commitments elsewhere, especially in Manchuria and China, where he was sending similar aid to forces resisting Japanese advances, drained off the pool of potential aid for Spain. Training of Republican pilots in French schools, which had been a useful supplement to their own meager resources, was terminated by the French during this time as well. These developments promised ill for the Republican Air Force's future. A few non-Russian types had also been procured one way or the other by the Republic in the last few months, and were on hand as autumn approached. There were numerous types of which 1 or 2 examples were purchased in Europe, sent across the French border during times when a sympathetic French government allowed some war material to pass over the Pyrenees. For example, 2 Ferry Feroce biplanes armed with cannon were purchased from Belgium and used for ground attack. The main non-Russian aircraft in Republican hands at this point was an American type purchased from a Canadian firm. These were Grumman GE-23 two-seater scout bombers, a variant of the contemporary FF-1 used by the U.S. Navy. Approximately 40 of these aircraft were purchased from the Canadian Car and Foundry Company, and originally been built for a Turkish order. They ended up in Republican hands and were formed into an Army cooperation unit called Grupo No. 28, which was formed after the Grummans arrived near the end of 1937. In September 1937, despite the losses incurred in the Northern Campaign and the counterattacks mounted on the other fronts, the Republic could muster more than 450 aircraft. The Rebel Air Force at this time could count on over 350. At this point on, however, the balance would begin to tip in Franco's favor. The rebels and their allies, meanwhile, refocused their activity on the Madrid area. Strikes on airfields in the region, including at Guadalajara and Bujarelos, provoked fierce combats in the air, and the month of November came to an end. During these battles, the 109s of JG-88 would have their first encounter with the improved I-16 Type 10s. This happened over the town of Alcalá de Henares on the 29th and 30th. The pilots of the 2nd Squadron claimed 3 of the new Russian machines. Franco's planned assault on the capital was put off, however, by yet another Republican offensive, this time against Teruel in the east. The attack began on December 16th, and the fighters of JG-88 were moved to the airfield at Calamoca, to the northeast of the town, to meet it. The operations here would take place in the middle of a severe winter, with frequent heavy snows, strong winds, and frigid temperatures. 109 squadrons would fly escort missions for the bombers of KG-88 as they struck at the oncoming Republican columns. The Heinkel squadrons engaged in their now well-practiced close support missions. Joining them in ground attack roles here were the newly arrived Stukas, which made their operational debut in the fighting around Teruel, and the Heinkel HS-123 biplanes of the experimental bomber unit. During the course of the fighting here, the Henschels would be turned over to the Rebel Air Force. By this time, the effectiveness of all German fighter operations was being greatly enhanced by the provision of radio equipment in the aircraft. The Jagdwaffe would remain in the Teruel region until February. Throughout this time, they encountered strong resistance from Republican aircraft. Many victories were recorded in the numerous actions fought here. By the end of January, JG-88 had recorded its 100th kill. The most successful day for the group as a whole was on the 7th of February, when German pilots accounted for 10 SV-2 bombers and 2 I-16 fighters. In this action, 4 of the bombers were shot down within the span of 6 minutes by Lieutenant Wilhelm Balthasar. This pilot would eventually go on to be one of the highest scoring Luftwaffe pilots in the Second World War. Another success came on the 21st, the day the city was recaptured by the rebels. On this day, the Jagdwaffe destroyed 7 more Republican aircraft. By March, the Condor Legion was supporting Franco's drive east across the Ebro and towards the Mediterranean coast. Around this time, the classic Fieseler Storch liaison aircraft began to arrive in the theater, demonstrating the usefulness of its capability of landing and taking off in very short distances without a prepared field. German fighters are based at Galore. The heavy aerial fighting over Teruel had exhausted the Republican Air Force, which was unable to put up much more resistance. All 4 German squadrons, therefore, flew against ground targets. This pattern would be repeated in all the early campaigns of the Second World War, and German fighters, once the enemy air force was neutralized, would turn to ground attack missions. During the pursuit of the Republican armies, this air support was very effective against the demoralized enemy. In particular, the strafing runs of the Legion's fighters were as instrumental in the rebel capture of the strong position at Caspe on the Ebro River. Encounters in the air were not absent from the Jagdwaffe's experience during the chase to the sea. 2 best days for the Germans were on the 10th and on the 24th. On each of these days, the German fighters downed 3 Republican planes. These numbers give an indication of the declining state of the Republic's air force at this point in the war. Germans took losses as well. On the 30th, 2 were killed in a mid-air collision over Alcaraz, while another died on the 4th from another mid-air collision that happened during a transfer flight. Enemy flak took a toll as well, bringing down 2 Heinkels with the loss of one of the pilots. On the 15th of April, rebel troops advanced to the Mediterranean coast between Tarragona and Valencia, cut the Republic in 2 once more. Once the sea was reached, a relatively weak rebel force was organized to begin push slowly southwards towards Valencia, the seat of the Republican government. Germany, which was currently involved with the annexation of Austria, was apprehensive of the reaction of other European powers to this move. This led to a restriction of the amount of war material dispatched to Spain at this time. Fortunately for the men of the Condor Legion, the Republican Air Force was very weak at this moment, and the rebel advance towards Valencia very slow. During the late spring and into the summer of 1938, JG-88 flew a reduced scale of missions and was moved to the airfield at Lasenia. Towards the end of this period, the first C model 109s arrived. Only a small number of these models were produced. They differed from the B model in using the UMO 210GA engine that was fitted with direct fuel injection, and the inclusion of 2 more MG-17 machine guns in the wings, bringing the total to 4. These C Model 109s were issued to the 3rd Squadron, which gave up its Heinkels and its ground attack missions in April. The commander of the 3rd Squadron, Adolf Galland, was replaced by Werner Mulders at the same time as the unit converted to the new fighter. First D models, also with the 4-gun armament, would appear at this time as well. In these relatively inactive months, some of the other contemporary German fighter types made their appearance in Spain. The other biplane fighter serving alongside the HE-51, the Arado AR-68, made its operational debut in Spain during this period. 3 of these fighters were sent to Lasenia Airfield. The AR-68 sent were E models, modified by the removal of the spats that normally were fitted to the fixed undercarriage members. They would be operated as what the Luftwaffe documents describe as interim night fighters. Night fighting experiments were flown over Castellón. They carried no specialized equipment for night combat, or even any blind flying aids, and were not very successful. Some sources claim that these Arados were organized into a temporary 5th Squadron of JG-88 during their tenure in Spain. Another aircraft that definitely was assigned temporarily to JG-88 and constituted a 5th Squadron during a short period as part of the organization was the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bomber. A small number of these early model Stukas were sent to Spain, and while they normally operated as part of the experimental bomber unit VB-88, they were included as part of JG-88 for part of 1938, likely due to the group's extensive ground attack experience. The final German fighter to appear in Spain was the HE-112, which had already appeared in prototype form. A second prototype, the V-9, was sent to fly with the Legion, where it would replace the V-3 lost over Vizcaya. This was a prototype of the B model 112, with a top speed of 320 miles per hour or about 510 kph. It was more heavily armed than any other German fighter in the theater, carrying 2 20mm MG-FF automatic cannon in the wings and 2 MG-17s in the nose. During its time in Spain, the V-9 was flown by Harro Harder. This and the previous prototype were the only 112s to be flown by the Germans in the Spanish Civil War. Most of the 112s sent to Spain would be delivered to the Rebel Air Force. 16 B model 112s were delivered in late 1938, and these would be by far the best fighters in Rebel hands until the advent of the E model Bf-109s at the end of the year. These were given to the Rebels' best pilots, and they soon replaced the CR-32 biplanes as the equipment of the Blue Patrol. Fighters of this elite unit would have the yoked arrows emblem on the phalange, or the Spanish Fascist Party, superimposed on the black discs of the normal Rebel fuselage markings. Persistent bad weather hampered air operations in late June and early July. By the 12th, however, preparations for the offensive on Valencia were completed. The attack began, and on opening day the fighters of JG-88 shot down 2 I-15s. On the 15th, no fewer than 9 were downed, one of them by Werner Mulders. During his time with the Legion, he would play a leading role in developing the loose 4-plane elements, or schwarms, that form the basis of Luftwaffe's effective fighter tactics in the larger wars to come. The Germans now demonstrated a clear ascendancy in the air, and on the 17th destroyed 6 more Chados, 4 Radas the next day, 5 more the next, and 3 Radas and a Chado on the 20th, making a total of 26 victories over the enemy's best fighters in the course of a week. Nor was this the end, as 4 more kills were scored on the 23rd. By the 25th, the Republic launched an unexpected offensive across the Ebro River to the north near Meconesa. The Legion responded quickly to the new attack, and JG-88 was rebased back to Lasenia to supply cover for the fighters of KG-88. The Republicans drove into rebel territory nevertheless, and it was not until early August that the advance was halted and the line stabilized. JG-88 scored its first kill here on the 27th of July when a Chado was destroyed. Fighters of the 3rd Squadron shot down 4 Chados on the 1st of August and brought down a Rado on the 2nd. Targets were becoming scarce, however, and it was another 10 days before the Jagdwaffe had its next success, taking down 3 SB-2s and an I-16. By the end of June, the Republic's fighter strength had been ground down to only 35 I-16s on hand out of more than 270 that had been delivered, but by the 14th of July they came back with a vengeance. The largest air battle of the Ebro campaign took place, involving JG-88's 1st and 3rd Squadrons. In the sprawling combat, the 2 squadrons accounted for a total of 6 I-16s. On the 19th, the rebel counterattack on the Ebro came. It was mounted by no fewer than 7 rebel and Italian divisions and had as its immediate objective the town of Fontarelle. Legion was committed to support this drive. The counterattack bogged down immediately on the ground, but in the air, JG-88 destroyed 4 I-16s over the lines. Throughout the remainder of August and into September, the fighting went on, with the rebels slowly gaining the upper hand. JG-88 continued to slug it out in the air as well, taking down 4 Republican planes on the 23rd and another 5 on the 9th of September. While these operations were going on, the commanders of many Legion units were changed as experienced men were rotated home. The sedate land crisis had brought the threat of general war to Europe again, and the Wehrmacht intended to have its best men on hand to meet the threat that might suddenly materialize on their own borders. This did little to hinder the remaining pilots of JG-88, who continued to dominate their now greatly reduced opponents. Between the 20th and the 27th of September, they claimed 18 kills, 10 of which were scored on the 23rd. 3 more Russian fighters would go down on the 4th of October. The last major effort on the Ebro came at the end of October. The Republicans gathered their remaining fighters, about 100, to resist the rebel onslaught. These failed to gain air dominance, and in the initial phase of the rebel push, 8 Radas and 2 Chatos were lost to the 2nd and 3rd Squadrons of JG-88. The rebel army achieved a decisive breakthrough at Pinel on November 3rd. This was the beginning of the end for the Republicans in the territory north of the rebel front, and by the 16th their armies had been driven back over their original start line. The Ebro battles had lasted 3.5 months and cost the Republic something like 300 aircraft. Of these, about 100 were the work of JG-88, 42 of these being credited to the 3rd Squadron alone. After the conclusion of the Ebro battles, the Legion was ordered to rest and refit, and only 1 squadron of JG-88 was kept at operational status. New command arrangements led to the replacement of Legion's commander, Volkmann, by von Richthofen. Werner Mulders was among the officers rotated back to Germany during this time, leaving the 3rd Squadron in charge of Oberleutnant Hubertus von Bohnen. On the 23rd of December, the last rebel offensive in which the Legion would play a major role was launched. This was directed against Catalonia and consisted of a drive on Barcelona and then to the French frontier. Catalonia was the industrial and commercial heart of Spain, and its fall would spell the end of any remote hopes for a Republican victory. Around this time, the first E-model 109s with the Daimler-Benz DB601 engine were delivered to La Seigne Airfield. This model was capable of a speed of 350 miles per hour, 555 kph, making it the fastest and best performing fighter in the theater. The original E1 variant carried 4 MG-17 machine guns. The E3 model, the last 109 type to be dispatched to Spain, added superior firepower to its other advantages by replacing the wing machine guns with a 20mm MG-FF automatic cannon. This E3 model 109 was a superior fighter by any measure to any other in Spain. Unfortunately, perhaps, Republican Air Force was already largely destroyed by the time it appeared in squadron service. The first week of the offensive saw heavy fighting, reaching an early peak between the 28th and the 30th. In these 3 days, the fighters of the Jagdwaffe shot down 16 Republican planes. Bad weather would close in again and persist, preventing operations as 1938 changed to 1939. By the 12th of January, however, improving conditions let the Germans get back in the air. They carried out a surprise low-level raid on several Republican airfields that morning, catching their planes on the ground, and destroyed 13 of them. On the 17th, the 3rd Squadron was involved in a dogfight which saw them shoot down 4 more. A few days later, the fighters were moved forward to the field of Villis to keep up with Franco's advancing armies. They captured Barcelona on the 26th, sealing the fate of the Republic. 2 days later, 109s of the 2nd Squadron flew patrols above the city while Franco's troops marched in triumph down the city's main thoroughfare. Operations continued against the broken remnants of the Republican armies as they fled towards the Pyrenees, until another round of bad weather brought operations to a halt on the 30th. The next week, JG-88 flew escort missions and conducted low-level attacks on the remaining enemy airfields, claiming 3 kills on the 5th of February and 4 on the 6th. The 6th also saw the group take its last combat loss in Spain, when a Bf-109E1 flown by Unterofficer Heinrich Wintermuth was shot down in flames during a raid near Villajuga. 1 month later, JG-88 would claim its last victory in Spain, an I-15 shot down by Oberleutnant Hubertus von Bohnen, leader of the 3rd Squadron. After the Catalonian campaign, the Legion was not involved in major combat operations. The last mission, flown by JG-88, was on March 27th when they escorted bombers of KG-88 on a bombing attack on Republican positions in the Madrid region during the final rebel assault on the capital. The Republicans there surrendered the same day, though fighting would continue elsewhere in the country for the next few days. At 1000 hours, von Richthofen would issue a short signal: all German units cease operations. Pilots of JG-88 and other groups of the Legion handed their planes over to Franco's men, who were now no longer rebels but the legitimate government of Spain. These planes would form the core of the Spanish post-war Air Force, would serve on in some cases for decades. The men of the Legion took ship in Vigo on the 28th of May and returned to Germany via Hamburg. They would immediately put to work, disseminating the lessons of their experience among the men of the rapidly expanding German war machine. A little more than 3 months later, many of those who had flown against the Republic in Spain would be putting their experience to the test in Poland. So that, in general outline, is the story of the German fighter in Spain. This topic was my original motivation for beginning this podcast. I originally intended to write a book on the subject, but I decided to do this instead, and I'm glad I did, as this has been very rewarding so far, and I've gotten in touch with some really good and supportive people in the course of figuring out how to produce something like this. The story of the German Air Force in Spain has always been really interesting to me. I think their experience, you could see the transition from the early air power technology and tactics inherited from the First World War, watch them give way to the new generation that would develop during the course of the Second World War. In Spain, this transition can be observed happening in the Jagdwaffe as the Heinkel biplane fighters yield to the Messerschmitts. So I hope you found some of what I had to say here interesting or useful. Needless to say, I had a great time doing the research for this one. I think next time I'm going to look elsewhere than Spain for a topic. I have a series in production right now covering the origin of the crack Tercio de Estranjeros, which is the Spanish Foreign Legion, and their war in Morocco during the 1920s against the forces of Abdelkrim, the indigenous leader who defied the Spanish colonial authorities throughout most of the decade. However, I think next I'll look at the origins of modern naval aviation in the years leading up to the First World War. We'll survey the pioneering work done on seaplane and carrier aviation, to see how this infant technology was developed and used in the great European conflict that erupted in 1914. So I hope that sounds interesting to you. As always, I hope you and yours are staying safe and healthy, and I hope you're enjoying this strange and interesting time as much as you can manage. Till next time then, I remain Mark 7, wishing you all the best.